Right, I think we're live. So good afternoon, everyone, and happy Thursday. Hope everyone is having a great week so far. You'll notice as you join, you'll be on mute and your video access won't be turned off. If you can keep it that way to avoid any background noise and distractions, I'd really appreciate it. Just a brief introduction from me. So I'm Matt Wood, Managing Consultant here at Fruition IT. Welcome to our third episode of our lockdown learning series. I'll shortly be handing over to our guest speaker, Ady Stokes, who will be giving you a short introduction to accessibility testing with some real life examples. Just to give you some background, we've scheduled a series of events to keep the tech community connected throughout this difficult period, for those who are missing the tech meetup scene and for those who would enjoy some personal development and knowledge sharing. Fruition IT, we are a IT digital change recruitment business based in Leeds. The plan for this is to give Ady 45 to 50 minutes to present his talk with a 10-minute window for questions at the end. If you want to keep your questions or comments until the end, Ady will do his very best to answer as many as possible, and you can use the chat function to do that as well, please. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Ady. Ady is a well-known figure and key member of the testing community in Yorkshire and across the UK. Ady has published his own blog, the besttesttheory.com, I believe it's called, where he says his, I've got it wrong. Big Test Theory, sorry, I think I've got a typo there. Where he shares his thoughts and opinions, and you can find details of his periodic table of testing there as well. Ady has given presentations to agile testing groups in London and in Yorkshire, and he really drives our internal testing community through talks, discussions and challenges. And Ady is one of the core organisers and members of the Ministry of Testing in Leeds. So Ady, over to you.
Right, so hello everybody. I'm just going to start presenting and share my screen. So if you can just confirm that you can see the start slide. Matt, can you confirm you can see the start slide?
Right, I can see it, Ady.
Right,
yes.
Just double check. Right, so my name's Ady Stokes. I've been in software testing since 2004, and previous to that I was in manufacturing, trained as an auditor and did a few other stuff. I've been learning about accessibility since 2015, where I was on the first digital project for a company, and one of my responsibilities was to understand how accessibility would affect what we were creating, what we needed to consider to make sure we had a product that was compliant. I always call myself an advocate rather than an expert because I still have lots to learn. But in all the conversations I've had since I started learning, people think of accessibility as very much a specialism, which it is, but there's a lot of things that we can all do to pick up that low-hanging fruit or consider when we're making things to make things more accessible to a lot more people. And it's very much, I always compare accessibility to security in that there's lots of things in security that we can be doing when we're testing our products. Matt covered that I'm a Ministry Test Leads meetup organiser. We're hoping to get that back up and running when we can meet again. I also did a power hour on accessibility with the club, on the club at Ministry of Testing, which is still there and a decent resource with lots of links to lots of things on. So I'd highly recommend you take a look at that if you want to learn a bit more about accessibility. It looks good on the CV, so I always put on that I've spoken at international conferences on accessibility, and I actually got accepted to my first US conference. So that's obviously not going to happen. So that's a bit of a shame, but hopefully it'll get sorted out for next year, like a lot of them have been arranged. So I have a lot of slides and a lot of information to get through. So I will do my best. I'll keep an eye on the time. The slide deck will be available at the end, and it has a couple of pages full of links with information that I talk about throughout here. But there's one thing that as testers we always try to do, which is think about all the different ways and all the different risks that could impact our products and impact our user experience. And Billy Gregory, who's a senior accessibility engineer, did this great quote that said, if we're only doing some user experience, shouldn't it be sucks rather than UX? So I quite like that as a quote, and I've got a couple of quotes throughout the presentation. But if you're looking at fundamentals of accessibility, you'll see this hashtag pop up a lot on Twitter and a bit more on LinkedIn. And a lot of people don't spot that the two L's in alley are actually ones. So the 11 in between the A and the Y is the number of characters in accessibility between the A and the Y. And it was formed when Twitter was 140 characters rather than 280 they have these days. And it's persisted. So if you're looking up information or you want to research accessibility on Twitter and find people to follow, you'll quite often find this hashtag used. Obviously the hashtag accessibility is used as well, but a lot of people use this one. So that's definitely one to keep an eye on if you want more information. So Tim Berners-Lee, who's widely credited with creating the World Wide Web, said right at the beginning, the power of the web is in its universality. Access by everyone, regardless of disability, is an essential aspect. So the original concept and the original idea for the web was to make sure everybody could do everything and be connected and use it. And if we're not considering accessible elements, what we're doing is preventing lots of people from interacting with our products. And like access is a fundamental right to public places and public spaces, the web is very public, therefore everybody's got a right to access that as well. So I'm going to start with how you can consider accessibility for your testing strategy. And these are things that I've done over the last 5 years that sort of built accessibility into the day-to-day things that we did in my previous company and build that accessibility into our thinking. So one of the things that I've done for quite a long while is I have allocated keyboard days. So just one day of the week where whenever I'm testing, I only use my keyboard rather than the mouse. Keyboard is very important when it comes to accessibility, that you can do everything that you can do with a mouse with a keyboard, because a lot of people just can't use a mouse. And there are a lot of keyboard alternatives for inputting information into websites. So if you can do everything with the keyboard, all those assistive technologies that different keyboards and replace keyboards can all use as well. Another thing we built into the strategy was screen reader sessions. And I wouldn't recommend screen reader days if you're not used to having headphones on and listening to a screen reader read out an experience for a website. It's a very different thing and something that you need practice to get it into and get used to. And I've got a few tips for doing that further on in the schedule. But you also need to schedule full reviews where you go through the full web content accessibility guidelines. Otherwise, you just won't know where you are overall. It's also useful to just have regular checks when you bring in new pieces of software. Specifically, if you add new elements onto a page, make sure they're in a logical order. You can tab to them. They interact right with your screen readers and things like that. As I say, all the slides are available afterwards. If I've rushed a bit and you're struggling to take notes, you can watch this back. And I'm open on all the socials for questions afterwards if there's anything I don't get to, so I'll try and pick those up. Other ways you can add these in is if you use personas in your company, you can create some accessible personas or add accessible elements into those. So if you've got a persona, make them a keyboard user, make them a screen reader user, give them low vision. So there's lots of ways you can add accessible elements to personas. You can think about accessibility in your acceptance criteria as a reminder. If it's not something you're used to thinking about, having these reminders and having these hints and cheat sheets and things like that is a decent way to do it. You can think about how you create your user stories to include it. And just basically by doing these, you're continuing to learn, but more importantly, add it to your product risks. Product risks is a good way of getting an overall look at your testing strategy and aligning your strategy with your risks. So making sure that accessibility is part of that is really important. So a few things I heard and still hear every now and again is that accessibility only affects a small number of people, and it's a very small user group and it won't impact your bottom line. But the World Health Organization estimated that more than 1 billion people live with some form of disability. That's about 15% of the world's population. So you're not necessarily talking about a small number of users when you're looking at who's using your software or your applications. And I try to explain it that for pretty much every accessibility problem, there's a situation where anybody could be affected by it. So the Microsoft Inclusive Design Toolkit, which there's a link at the end and I'd strongly encourage you to have a look at some point, explains accessibility as permanent, temporary and situational, as in this little image on the screen. So somebody who has an arm amputated is permanent use of one arm. If you have an arm injury that incapacitates it, you are in the same situation, but only temporarily. And in this example, if you're holding a small baby as a new parent, then you only have one arm available. I'd suggest you want to hold a baby with two arms, but that might just be me. So I use the example of when we used to have meetups and we went to the pub afterwards, we'd have a drink and then we'd be tweeting about how awesome the thing was we'd just seen. So we'd be using our phone with one hand. So that's how I explain it. As affecting everybody. So that's just something to think about and a really good resource to have a look at. So what's wrong in terms of accessibility in the real world? I have a session that's an interactive accessibility quiz that has 10 images on it. I've pulled a couple out for this session. And with every image, there's generally one main thing that's wrong with terms of accessibility. And a few other things that are also affected. So in this case, we've got the Honourable Donald J. Trump, President of the United States, being very diplomatic and threatening the President of Iran and going on a bit of a rant. But what's wrong in terms of accessibility here is using lots of capital letters is really hard for a lot of screen readers to interpret as words. So they look at them as acronyms. So what you would find here is the screen reader would read out to Iranian President Rouhani, N-E-V-E-R, comma, E-V-E-R, and so on and so forth. So that doesn't make a very good user experience for somebody with the screen reader. Now, as I said, that's the main one, but there are other things that can be wrong with having all capitals. Jakob Nielsen, a usability expert and founder of the Nielsen Foundation, he did a lot of research about reading from paper to screens, and he found that depending on the individual, screens were about 10 to 12% slower to read than actually reading off paper. If you then put capitals and add those into it, we're not used to reading all capital text. So again, it takes another 10 to 12% of time for us to read those capitals and understand it. For people with neurocognitive issues like autism and dyslexia, it becomes really, really hard for them to read it, and they struggle to actually see any words that's there because of the blocked nature of using all capitals. So what's wrong in terms of accessibility with using all capitals? And this was very prominent on the web a few years ago, and thankfully it seems to be reducing significantly now, where people put blocks of capitals. So if you have any of those on your site, you should seriously reconsider putting them down to normal text. So this is another one that I came across on the web. I was really curious to understand what I was looking at here. So again, we have all capitals, which makes it really hard for screen readers. But one of the main things that's wrong here is the amount of space between the buttons, so there's very little padding. So for someone with a motor neuron disease that has hand trembles or something like that, it would be really hard for them to just pick out an individual one, because I've blown this up to a bit bigger for the purposes of the presentation. But in a similar way, if you're commuting on a train and the train's moving and your hand's moving, it would be also an equivalence to try and hit that. Another interesting thing here is that you should describe your links accurately, and none of these three descriptions for me actually tell you where you're going or what you're actually going to do. So that becomes problematic in a way. So those, as I said, buttons too close and links being descripted are probably equal in terms of what's wrong in terms of accessibility. But what I found really, really interesting about this is when I tried to tab to this, the tab didn't actually work to get to it, so it wasn't keyboard accessible either when I was using my phone to try and tab to it in accessibility mode. So there was lots of things wrong with this, and it was just quite a bad site anyway. So I didn't venture too far. I'll click the link, but you can see how if you've got these sorts of buttons set up, it would be quite hard for people to use. What's wrong in terms of accessibility here? Well, pop-ups in general can be quite problematic in lots of different ways. So when you pop something up, it doesn't always take keyboard focus, or it takes keyboard focus in the wrong place. For example, this example I've put on the screen, the keyboard focus went straight to the accept button, which was read out as ACCEPT, another capital issue. But it didn't tell me what I was accepting or why I was accepting it. I could tab to the very small and very bad UX example of the read more bit underneath it, which I know is hard to see if you're on a smaller screen. But it tabbed to there and then back to accept. So it was a keyboard trap. There was actually no way of getting out of this and closing the box with a little X at the top, which was really quite annoying. So when you're thinking about any sort of pop-ups at all, think about where the keyboard's going to focus on it so that screen readers can read it out. Think about keyboard navigation all the way around it, and think about what screen readers are going to hear when that pop-up appears. Does it pop up passively, which I've seen on quite a few occasions. And I think my final example is again another pop-up that you see on places like YouTube and streaming sites, that you're watching some content and then up in the corner an ad starting soon pops up. I've done this as an example which has a lot of similarities to one before it, but there's a little timer on there, and what you're doing is potentially putting people under pressure about what's going to happen next. If you're on a screen reader, this wasn't announced, it wasn't seen, it wasn't keyboard focused, it just took over the thing and changed it to a video. And if you're just listening with a screen reader, all of a sudden your program disappears, and the thing you were listening to just stops and something else starts. You have no idea why, you have no idea how long it's going to take, you have no idea where you're going back to the program you're going to. So if you're going to invade someone's experience with one of these things that pops up, or overrides, then you should seriously consider how that experience is going to be for people. So there's a little bit of a summary, and the last statement on there, which is about emotional accessibility, I'll cover a little bit later on. So I'll explain what that means before we finish. So these are, for those who know me or have been on my website, will probably know that I like a good heuristic or a visual heuristic, and I created the periodic table of testing some years ago, and before that the periodic table of data, and this is one I put together called the Accessibility Quadrants. Accessibility is not just about people with disabilities, it's about inclusion and making sure everybody can access the features and the functions of anything we create. Which means not only thinking about compliance, which is the main focus people think about when they're talking about accessibility or considering accessibility, but it's also the usability of it, how the language is presented so that everybody can understand it, and also inclusive language, which is very important these days. It's really important for for people to be considered. I signed up to something the other day that my only options were Mr. or Mrs. And when you're buying some socks and completing a form, they don't really need to know if you're a Mr. or a Mrs. It was a completely pointless thing. So I basically took my business elsewhere because it seemed very false to me and very pointless. They also wanted my sex, and that options was male and female, and so that wasn't very inclusive either. So that was just a bit of a terrible form. Anyway, so I'm going to go in a little bit more detail in these accessibility quadrants. So the reason I included readability is when I was doing research for a talk a couple of years ago called Accessibility Assumptions and Arguments, I wanted to take a lot of assumptions I'd heard about accessibility and investigate if they were really true. In terms of readability, I came across these figures from elinet.eu in 2018, and they'd identified that 55 million adults between the ages of 15 and 65 years of age have literacy difficulties. And they coined the term, well, I don't know if they coined the term, but it was the first time I came across the term functionally illiterate. And the description of that means that in general day-to-day interactions, like driving a car around the streets and reading street signs and understanding what they mean, people can function. But in terms of literacy, they couldn't sit down and read a book. They would struggle to fill in forms and online things like that. So they were functionally illiterate. I find it a staggering figure that there's so many adults. So it sort of highlights the importance that if we're presenting information and products and functions to the general public, unless it is in a highly specialized context, like say science or engineering, we should really be thinking about the language we use, and there's lots of tools out there to help us understand what reading levels we're at. And it's really important that we make sure that everybody can be included in what we're trying to get out there. Marvin Minsky, I also came across, I again came across for the first time the term suitcase words, and it made me think a lot about the words I use in my presentations and things like that. So he said that things like intelligence or understand, quality or work have so many different contexts that you really need to be clear what you're talking about. You can talk about an intelligent animal, but you have to be really contextually clear on what you mean by intelligent in that context. So again, it's something to think about when we're looking at copy to go on a website or putting sentences together that the public will view about what we're doing and why we're doing it and who's going to read it. I'd highly recommend David W. Augsburger. His books talk a lot about love, caring and compassion, and this sort of resonated with me, that being heard is so close to being loved that for the average person, they're almost indistinguishable. So just having those considerations about whether you need to put a title like Mr. and Mrs. on a form, having more than binary sex options, or having other, I think Facebook now has quite a few options as well as another. So these options are out there, these options are being used, and they make people feel included. So I know there's a lot of arguments around this, where what is and isn't should be represented as a sex, but that's not for us to judge. That's just to make sure that people are included in what we're doing and showing that compassion and empathy for people. In terms of usability, I like this quote from Alan Cooper, which is, if we want users to like our software, we should design it to behave like a likable person. And he defines a likable person as respectful, generous and helpful. If you follow UX design forums and different blogs and stuff like that, in different ways, those are the things they are describing when they're looking at what is really good UX. It's helpful, it reduces errors preventing people making errors before they submit it. That could be by blocking the input button until everything's filled in. There's lots of different ways to do it, putting inline help items. As long as we're considering that those inline help items are read out by screen readers and things as we're doing it, it's, as I say, accessibility is seen as a specialism for a reason, because everything can potentially have an impact on more than one thing. So it's definitely worth considering these sorts of things. You'll have to excuse me, but I keep getting a pop-up over my slide and I can't seem to move it. In terms of compliance, with legal rulings being made regularly to enforce accessibility, it will soon be like security, very much a have to have, not a nice to have. Now, some random bloke said this, and I believe him, because the amount of cases in the US has literally skyrocketed over the last couple of years in terms of people being sued or people being taken to court or lawsuits being filed in terms of sites not being accessible. One of the biggest ones here was, and it's still going on, the Domino's Pizza Company. Someone who was blind couldn't access either their website or their app to order pizza online because it had so many accessibility issues, didn't read stuff out, wasn't nice to use. So they simply couldn't fulfill their orders, so they brought it up with them. They didn't respond to him, so they filed a lawsuit. It's gone all the way through the US legal system, all the way up to the Supreme Court, and Domino's have lost in every turn. Now, an insider at Domino's leaked that the cost of the fix was less than, I think he quoted less than $40,000. And Domino's, the last time I saw an update, had spent over $1.5 million defending this in the courts. Now, their justification for this was to get a clear ruling so that everybody understood what they needed to do with websites and apps. But my argument for that is, you could have done that and fixed your app, which they still haven't done. So that's why I don't order Domino's. Pizza was better anyway. So then we come to compliance, which is the main one that people focus on. And around the world, there are different enforcement rules, but a lot of countries are now picking up that when it comes to web compliance, they want you to meet the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. The main one that came out was 2 and was around for quite a lot of time. 2.1 came out about 18 months ago, in, I believe, June 2018, and that added 12 new things to do with mobile accessibility. And 2.2, which has been called Silver for quite a while, but now they've gone back to 2.2, is in draft and available on the W3 website. I wouldn't recommend, if you want to start learning about accessibility and looking stuff up, you go to the W3 website where the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines are. For version 2.1, there are over 1,500 pages of explanations about what these guidelines are. And it's very complicated. You can get lost very quickly and get overloaded with information. It comes in 3 different levels. Level A is the simplest. A is very much the standard that everybody aims for, and anything that's AAA tends to speak about embedded videos and embedded content, and if it needs audio descriptions or subtitles or text to go along with it, and so on and so forth. So A is very much the one. If you want to start looking at it, have a look at that level first. Now, the W3 use this POUR acronym of perceivable, operable, usable, and robust as an example, and I'm just going to slide through that fairly quickly. Time is against us. So perceivable means being aware of something through sight, hearing, or other senses. So a lot of that is about, if you're making things available in one way, you need to make sure they're available in the other ways that they can be perceived. So if you have text on a website, you need to make sure that a screen reader can replicate that experience for someone reading information out from the screen. Again, screen readers and the way a lot of websites focus when you're tabbing down a page, they'll tab into a field, but they'll ignore all the text in between if you're not careful and it's not set up in the right way. So it's just making sure that everybody perceives information that is given in a similar way. There's a few little lines on there, and you can look back at these, but I'm not intending to read all these out. In terms of operable, it's the act of being able to use something regardless of ability, and again that covers things like keyboard accessible, making all functionality available from a keyboard rather than having to use a mouse. This also covers things like not putting flashing images or things that might give people seizures. giving enough time to understand the content. It's reasonably straightforward, and it's easy to understand than going directly to the guidelines themselves. But it doesn't give you tons and tons of data of what that actually means. Understandable, again, is I've equated this to readability. It's making sure it's readable and understandable to as many people as possible. But it also covers making sure if you've got a multi-page website and you have a menu layout, it's making that menu layout the same in all the pages. So it's you can predict if you're getting used to using the website without actually seeing it. You can predict where you're going. If you're using a website with seeing it, you know where to interact with the menu at the same place all the time, rather than moving stuff around. I'm not sure what clean code means in this description of robust. Full complement of capabilities. I'm also not sure what they quite mean by that. But in the blurb that comes along with it, which there is quite a lot, it does mention shared experience, which is sort of covered under the other ones. So again, I don't think this is the best example to use, but this is what the W3 website and the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines point you towards. So I just wanted to make you aware of it. So I tried to come up with something a little bit more simple that was a little bit more understandable, and I call it the 4 Ks of accessibility. And those are keyboard, contrast, context, and content. So keyboard, again, it's really important that everything that can be done just through a keyboard, because as I mentioned earlier, there are quite a lot of alternatives to keyboards being used for lots of different people. In 2019, a website called WebAIM, and that stands for Web Accessibility in Mind, did a 1 million homepage review in terms of accessibility. And of those 1 million web pages, 98%, I will repeat that, 98% of websites had some form of accessibility issue. Now, of all those pages that had an issue, contrast was the #1 issue. And that was people putting light text on light backgrounds, not having text large enough. There's lots of different ways that you can struggle with contrast. Now, I gave a talk at Atelier in Leeds a few years ago when I used to use 5% grey backgrounds and black text for all my presentations. As you can see now, I've swapped it the other way around because I found that using a black background with white text works in a lot more environments. It makes it a lot clearer. So in Leeds, in Atelier, there was a strip light above the screen. So when I was putting images on the screen, they were really hard to see for the audience. So we had to turn the front lights off for them to see them. So that's a consideration you need to make. Context, again, is very important. If you've got links, the text for those links need to describe exactly what's going to happen and where it's going to go. Alt text for all images, it's important to get the right alt text, and again in the right context, because if you have a decorative image, you don't really need to describe a vase of flowers on a sideboard to somebody who's navigating through a website who can't see it or using a screen reader. If it's an important image that they do need to see, you need to make sure your alt text is descriptive and to the point and doesn't go on for too far. I had a little story a year or so ago. There was a guy pulling his hair out. He had a website he was testing, and he needed to find a way of checking that all 3,000 images on that website had alt text. In terms of context, it was a site selling a lot of different types of batteries. Now, for a screen reader experience, you don't need a description of what the battery looks like. You just need to know what its product details are. So when I explained to this person that you can just use ARIA hidden to hide all those 3,000 images, you wouldn't then need to check that they all had alternative text, and it would make a better experience for their customers who were using screen readers. He was very relieved because he'd been really struggling with this and getting really stressed over it for a period of time. So again, it's a bit of a myth that all images on the web need alt text. It's very much context dependent. Making sure your form input labels are reflected in what you see on the screen and what a screen reader hears is really important. Having one main element on a page, having country and language defined. These are all sorts of things that give context to the different types of technologies and assistive technologies that might be interacting with your pages. In terms of content, we've covered a few of these. Capitals, justified text. If justified text means aligning it to both the left-hand and right-hand side of the page. Now, what can happen there is if you stretch the text so it's aligned on both sides, it makes the gaps between the words different sizes, and people with autism and dyslexia really struggle to read then and tend to focus on the gaps in between the words. And there's a phenomenon what's called white rain that I came across a couple of years ago, and they literally lose all the words on the page and can only see the gaps in between. So it's really important to pick a left or a right hand side if you're justifying text. Don't use justified. And unfortunately, a lot of universities do this. I've put size and zoom on there. Obviously, you should be having a responsive design to work on different sizes of screens and things like that. But it is part of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines to, excuse me, to zoom into 200% and 400% on mobile devices. So it's really important you consider that as part of your designs, making sure that zooming in doesn't change the layout so that the order gets messed up or that it changes the functionality. I've sort of covered the other stuff there, like gender neutral, readability, complexity. So I'll just move on from that, and hopefully that just gives you a little cheat sheet and something to consider in terms of accessibility that's a bit easier than the other ones I've seen out there. When it comes to screen readers, again, it is a really different experience if you're not used to using these. And what you'll find is when you come to forms and input forms, the screen reader will read out the label that's given to the input field. It will then tell you what type of input field it is, and then tell you the current status of it. So if you've got a username input field, it would say something like username, input field, blank, editable. So you know there's nothing in there and you can type in it. This takes a bit of getting used to going into different fields. And I had one, it was only a few weeks ago, I had one where I tabbed into a field and it repeated the same thing about 4 times and then said something like content, which was very weird, and none of that was on the screen. So the screen reader experience was just horrible, and something that's easy to fix. I put heading levels on here as well as something to consider, because one of the if you load a page up with the screen reader active and do nothing, it will read the page from top to bottom and it will keep going. Generally, by using a down arrow to read everything on the page to you if you don't interrupt it. But what a lot of people do who are used to using websites and stuff, they use shortcuts to navigate around a page. So they might list out all the heading levels and see what's there, because each heading level should have a label. So there's lots of different ways of using it. So it's very important to, like I say, if you've never done it before, it's a very worthy task. And there's the best one I can recommend is NVDA, which is a screen reader that's available from WebAIM. They sponsor it. It's free to use. It has a reasonable functionality. It works. It's designed for Firefox, but it works really well in Chrome as well. And it's free, it's easy to use, and it's definitely something I'd recommend as an experience, just to see that different level and just empathize with how different people are using your software and seeing if the experience matches what you have when you're being able to see what you're presenting. Again, keyboard use, very important. I've mentioned it a few times. Making sure you have a logical order, making sure there's no keyboard traps. I went on a high street retail bank's site, and in 6 tabs I was trapped in a little side bit that I couldn't get out of without either refreshing the page or clicking out of it with the mouse. So obviously they've now, a bit of a hobby of mine is if I come across any really bad accessibility issues with any websites I come across, I'll contact them and I'll let them know. So they got an email off me. Another thing to consider is overridden shortcuts. Most keyboards and most operating systems have a lot of keyboard shortcuts. The people who interact with the web just using the keyboard rely on. It can be quite easy to incidentally override those keyboard shortcuts and stop people using them. And it's very important that we don't override third-party use applications that might want to alter the experience of the user, because there's quite a lot of extensions that do that now, and it's important we let people use our sites as they want to use it in the best way for them. In terms of tools, the best and simplest one I came across is called Wave, and I've mentioned them a few times. I make no apologies for that. WebAIM website, the Web Accessibility Mind people, they sponsored this as well. It's the Web Accessibility Evaluation Tool. I know that doesn't quite work as an acronym, but it's called Wave. You can navigate to it on the web and put a URL in, or you can download an extension that works in Chrome and Firefox again. The extension is literally a basic little click and you get a panel on the left hand side. What's good for this tool is it puts a little label on everything it finds. If you click the label, it will tell you why something's wrong, explain what the problem is and how to fix it. It also has a little shortcut that can take you directly to the code that is affecting what they've seen and what the findings are. So you can see the screen and the code at the same time, side by side, to work out what it is that might be wrong, and it gives you much better feedback for if you're pairing with the developer or you're feeding directly back to somebody who's made changes. It gives you really good feedback on that. I must say, in the last couple of months, I have found 2 websites that Wave would not run against, and I had to resort to developer tools and things like Lighthouse and WebAx to do my interrogation. But as an introduction to accessibility web tools, Wave would be my #1 recommendation. I'd also recommend that you be very careful when you're reporting stuff, because every automated tool can do false positives. The best experts in the world say you can only automate about 40% of accessibility issues, so a lot of it needs manual inspection and analysis to understand exactly what issue it is. So I appreciate I've got about 5 minutes left, so I might have to skip through some slides here, but I think it's really important that I mention considering emotional accessibility. This is a term first coined by Matt Parker, who I did my Accessibility Power Hour with. His son has autism, so he spent a lot of time looking at ways to make his son's life better and interact with him in different ways, and he's found quite a few issues with his son using different websites on his tablet and things like that that affects his son emotionally, and he calls these violating emotional expectations. To give an example of that, I've got a few stories that Matt tells that I like to share, but there's one in particular. His son smashed a couple of laptops, sorry, a couple of tablets, and Matt replaced them, but he couldn't work out why his son was getting so frustrated and throwing the tablet around. So he got a really tough one. His son threw the laptop again, and he finally worked out that he was watching something on YouTube and an ad had popped up and overridden, and he'd violated his son's expectations. His son had an expectation of when he watched something on YouTube, he would watch it through to the end without interruption, and these pop-up ads and spoiled that experience and obviously caused him emotional distress. So they now use different screening services. But emotional accessibility is thinking about how things could add pressure to people, so having countdown clocks that can't be extended, violating their expectations by not saying up front whether something would happen. If you're going to run an advert over something, do it right at the beginning. Make sure people can dismiss it at the earliest possible time easily. Again, it's just thinking about including people and thinking about different ways that could be interacted with your products. Now I've got a few slides here on mobile accessibility, and again we'll put the slide deck up and share that. But about 91% of people were found that used a wireless device used a screen reader. So screen reader usage is very common, and it's not just people who can't see or have very low vision. People who are illiterate use screen readers. People who are dyslexic use screen readers. So it's a much wider audience that you might consider and not just one type of user. So again, if you're giving you a product that might be accessed through a phone or through an application, it's really important to think about how that's going to be used. Now, in my workshops, I have a section about mobile accessibility learning is doing. So I fell into a trap that I was playing with accessibility settings on my phone on a train journey. All phones have a shortcut to turn accessibility settings on and off. On my iPhone, it's a triple tap, so I can turn my iPhone accessibility settings on and off very quickly. Android, it's quite often both volume keys, but there are a good few alternatives out there. So I would recommend at some point, go to your settings, turn your shortcut on and have a play with your phone in accessibility mode. Basically, the whole screen becomes like a trackpad on a laptop, and you can use 1, 2 and 3 finger gestures and swipes to interact with your phone in a different way. For example, most of them are 2 finger swipes across and back, are tabbing forward and back through the applications on your phone. So again, it's a completely different way of doing it. You've got built-in screen readers like TalkBack or VoiceOver on iPhone. So it's definitely something worth trying. Now, I have a few other slides on mobile accessibility, but I can see I've got roughly a minute left to talk. So I'm going to really whiz through these. Just consider what happens with light changes like me in my presentations. There are resistive screens still out there that are a bit softer. So how is that going to work if you're using a stylus? What happens when you're moving around or changing rotation, which is in there. Think about slow, fast and average networks, and Charles is a really good tool for that. We are working, generally speaking, in offices or at home where we have robust Wi-Fi to do our testing on. When you use data or 3G and 4G networks, it's not always the same. So just consider how it might be used and how it might perform doing lots of that. Some common errors. Disabling pinch to zoom is one that happens a lot more often than you'd expect. Unspoken messages. You can read the screen. Basically, a lot of the things that apply to your testing on a desktop in terms of accessibility apply to a mobile phone, although it's used in slightly different ways. So a lot of the principles and a lot of the things apply whether you're on a mobile, whether you're on a tablet, or whether you're on a desktop. So just consider those. I've got a bit on reporting. But finally, I'd like to thank you for listening to me rattle on for the last 50 minutes or so. There will be a survey out with the things. It won't be that one, it'll be a fruition one. But if you fill that in and give me feedback, anything that says how I can improve is the most useful to me. But anything that you found helpful also is useful. So hopefully I've created a couple of accessibility interests out there, maybe a couple of accessibility advocates. So thank you very much for your time. And as I said, at the end of the slide, there is a couple of resources that you can you'll be able to get access to. So I'm going to stop sharing now, hand back to Matt, and then hopefully we will do a few questions.
Hi everyone, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you very much for your very insightful presentation. Does anyone have any questions for Ady?
This is Manjeet.
Hello.
Manjeet,
yeah. Is there any pointers you can give us on automation, how to automate accessibility?
Yeah, as I said, there is quite a lot of information out there on what you can and can't automate. I would just say make it a consideration as part of your automation framework and sort of build up slowly. We started off when we were looking to add a few more things into ours. We started off with just making sure every element on a page was reachable by a keyboard. We also added things in there like making sure that heading levels were in order rather than jumbled or multiple jumping about. Just start small and work your way up. Like I said, there's quite a lot of information out there on ways to add accessibility into your automation. Some people are now calling on Lighthouse to run when they make a commit, to have a feed out that they can review afterwards as part of continuous delivery pipelines. So any of those sorts of things are worth considering.
Thank you.
Sweet potato delivery.
Hi, Ady. I'm Anu. I work for HMRC. My question is around AI services. Like, what would you suggest for what would be your approach to test AI services, like for accessibility testing?
Okay, so we started with the really easy ones. AI is an area that I've been involved a lot in. I do have quite an interest in AI and machine learning and how that happens. Again, I think whatever environment you're in, you need to basically apply all the principles. So are you presenting the information in a way that is understandable in the context in which it's being presented? If you're talking about chatbots, are they using plain and simple language to reply? If they're putting up links to direct you to somewhere, are they using descriptive links? So a lot of the principles that I talked about throughout the talk present for accessibility in any sort of area or any sort of device would apply in the same way. You might have to apply them slightly differently, but the principles are the thing that you need to sort of look at and see how you can, how they might be overcome. But great question though, thank you.
Do you recommend?
Sorry.
So do you recommend, like, are there any special tools, like for example, like on the web-based accessibility testing on the web pages? Like I've been testing quite a lot with Axe and Arc tools or Arc Toolkit on Chrome browser, and like I was using screen readers and the other tools. But I'm just wondering, like, are there any other tools in the market that focusing mainly on the AI services?
I've not heard any tools specifically mention that they're for AI services, I'm afraid. If I come across any, if you want to follow me on Twitter, if I come across anyone, I will probably tweet them out, because I know quite a few people who are interested in AI and ML. So when I come across things like that, I tend to tweet out links or retweet things. But I've not come across anything specifically for that, no, I'm afraid.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Ady. One more question from my end. Like, from your point of view, what are the good websites, or at least, which meets all the accessibility criteria standards as met? Like, do you have any websites which you can recommend?
So is that websites that are very good for accessibility, or?
Yes.
Right. So to be honest, the first one that comes to mind is the BBC website. The BBC website, they put a lot of effort, and I know people who work for the BBC, they put a lot of effort into making their website accessible and giving alternatives and things like that. So that's a very good place to have a look at how they align their menus. They have a really good blog that I'd recommend you look up, the BBC blog. And there's also, I know people don't like to champion the government on a lot of things, but the government has a really good blog on how they make their stuff accessible as well. Gov.co.uk is a website that has a lot of different services for a lot of different things. They try to use really simple design. They tend to get a lot of things right and done really well. So there's a couple of blogs there that I would suggest you go and have a look at for examples of good ways of doing stuff. Hayden Pickering has a website called Accessible Components, where he actually describes the type of code you need to use to make components really accessible. Now, some of that stuff has sort of been overridden by the advent of HTML5, and HTML5 sort of takes away a lot of the stuff that we needed to create accessible components for, and we needed ARIA labels for. So if you're using the HTML5 platform, a lot of the stuff that we had to really consider and build in is already done for you. But if you're moving from 4 to 5 and you just update then you can find clashes with things. But yeah, those two places, BBC and gov.co.uk blogs, I would suggest are really good places to go and have a look at examples of websites where they're really considering accessibility and they're doing their best to make sure it's accessible to as many people as possible.
Thank you, Ady.
You're very welcome.
I think we've got time for one more question.
Yeah. Hi. I don't know if you can hear me. It's Vic here. Hi, Ady. Well, thank you very much for a great presentation. I'm glad I joined. Not least because we're redesigning our customer onboarding experience. So this is really, really relevant. My question is very similar to something a couple of guys have asked before. Do you have any cheat sheets and like tools for specific personas or people with certain types of disability, breaking accessibility down by, for example, somebody who has reading disability versus, being able to type, like the examples you gave, somebody could have a permanent or temporary disability, their hands are, either hand injury or holding a baby example. So are there any cheat sheets that you can, or even websites, and this website is really well designed for people with, reading disability versus this website is very good for people with typing disability?
Well, I don't think I've described it in exactly that way, but when the slide deck's available, the last 2 pages, I'm pretty sure there's a link on there, which is it's called the alphabet of accessible personas. So there's a lot of examples of accessible personas there. In terms of cheat sheets, on my website, thebigtesttheory.com, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1, I've basically done a cheat sheet of the simplified version of the instruction and what you can use to test for it. Now, I make no apologies, quite a lot of those are visual inspection because of the way accessibility works, but that's like, it's like you can download it in Word if you want to take it and edit it for your own purposes, or you can download it as a PDF. It's about 6 pages long. So there's quite a lot of content there, but it does give you little hints about what tools you can use for different things, what you need to look at, and different ways of doing stuff. It's very brief because it is a cheat sheet. And if you have a look at that and anything's not really clear, just DM me on Twitter or ping me a message in any of the different ways. You can get me on all the socials. All my messaging things are up, and I've got nothing shut off. Because I do get questions pretty much every day from various people all over the place. Ask them to point them in directions or ask them about different stuff. So I'm quite willing, if you've got any questions afterwards or you find something that's not clear, just hit me up on Twitter or LinkedIn, and I'll try and answer that. But
that's great. That's wonderful. Did you say these slides that you've presented today, they will be distributed, or is it possible to get a copy of these?
Yeah, so this talk, Matt might be able to answer this better, but this talk will be on YouTube at some point in the future. There will be a place for the slides, and I'm going to include a few different things I put in my participation pack for people who attend my workshops. So I'm going to put a few things on there. And like I said, link at the end of the slide directly to quite a thing. And I think pretty sure there's a link to my website on here a couple of times.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Ady. And thanks, Matt.
You're very welcome.
No problem at all. So I think that's in our time up. So thank you everyone for joining us. As Ady mentioned, we will be putting this presentation live onto our YouTube channel, and we'll ensure every attendee has visibility of the slides as well. If you have any further questions, feel free to contact Ady via LinkedIn, Twitter, whatever means possible. And thank you very much for your time. Ady, thank you for taking time to present to everyone. Really appreciate it. We'll be sending a survey out as well. If you can take your time to complete that forward, we would really like to hear your feedback, and that will get back to Ady as well. So thank you again. Enjoy the rest of your day, and catch up soon.
Yeah, and thank you for all the nice comments in the chat.
Thank you. Thank you. Stay safe.
Bye now.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.